I call the Honourable Member Phil Twyford.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. We thought long and hard on this side of the House about how we would vote when the Select Committee was preparing to report back to the House. And it's really more in sorrow than in anger that we reported back that we would not be voting at the second reading for this bill, and our position, sir, remains the same. And the reason I make that comment is that, as the Minister has acknowledged, there has been a high degree of cross-party commitment on the Building Act review process, going back to the mid-2000s. And like the Minister, I want to acknowledge my colleague Shane Jones and the efforts that he made as the Minister to build a broadly supported process of review that moved us on from the 2004 Act in the direction of a lighter, more finely tuned and targeted regulatory framework for our construction industry that would deliver the outcomes that we all want: safe, healthy, durable buildings, and particularly safe, healthy and durable houses for New Zealanders to live in. So we listened very carefully to the submissions at the Select Committee, and it may be true that the Minister's been to Bunnings and Mitre 10 and everywhere else around the country and asked them about what they think of the bill, but the submitters, one after another, including all the major industry bodies, came to the Select Committee and expressed major reservations about, not about the Building Act review, Minister, but about this bill. And one after the other said this was an ill-advised, piecemeal approach that actually threatened greater risk on the industry and the consumer than needed be the case, that what's required under the principles of the Building Act review is a root and branch reform that deals with issues of not only risk-based consenting, but liability and consumer protection. And that to advance, as this bill does, with a couple of very specific aspects of the review, without the accompanying measures dealing with liability and with consumer protection, risked actually putting the consumer in a more vulnerable position. And I don't think anybody in their right mind, after the experience that this country has had with leaky buildings over the last 20 years, wants to put the New Zealand consumer at more unnecessary risk. The basic argument that we heard that I think we'll tease out in the course of these committee stages is that one of the main things that this bill does is that it sets out to more clearly define the responsibilities of the different players. So in a way that's basically set down as a sort of guidance, but will nevertheless undoubtedly be used as direction in future court cases as the law develops. This bill sets out to define the responsibilities of the builder, of the consumer, of the designer, and of the building consent authorities. Okay, so no one, I think, objects with that in itself. The thing is that what it does is that it circumscribes the current responsibilities and liabilities of the BCAs and everybody in the building consent authorities. And everybody knows that the defining feature of the construction industry and liability issues through the whole leaky homes saga has been that the councils, who make up most of the building consent authorities, are the only ones who have deep pockets. And they have been left, the ratepayer has been left as the last man standing. And has been in many, many cases, has been the only source of any kind of redress or compensation for affected homeowners. Now, the problem with scaling back the liability or responsibility of councils and, as building consent authorities, is that who is left to step into the breach? Now, under the reallocation or the defining of responsibilities under Section 14 in the bill, Mr Chair?
I call the Honourable Member Phil Twyford.
Is that there is no equivalent reapportionment of responsibility and liability to other partners. So we heard a lot of considered opinion from submitters that the effect of Section 14 is to scale back the liability of building consent authorities, but there's no equivalent replacement of responsibility and liability. And many of the industry bodies, many of the practitioners, and a lot of very wise heads in the industry came to us and said, it's a mistake to go down this track, reduce the liability of the building consent authorities without properly embarking on consideration of a change from joint and several liability, which is the legal status quo that we have in New Zealand, which means that a party can end up carrying the can for a much greater share of the liability than they would do if that liability was determined only by the share of their contribution to the actual construction project. And it's that principle that's meant that the last man standing, whether it's a council or anyone else, has often carried the can way in excess of their actual responsibility. So a lot of people believe that in the industry, and I was glad and interested to hear the Minister say that he would like to see the question of liability addressed and dealt with, and move away from joint and several. Well, I heard the Minister say that he would like to see that happen. He says it's very hard. Well, that may be so, but is it good lawmaking? Is it sensible stewardship of the New Zealand construction industry and the rights and the well-being of hundreds of thousands of New Zealanders who go down the track of building their own homes or having houses built? Is it right to subject them to a reduction in their protection and liability in the way that this bill does? So that's what was meant when people came to the committee and when we said with the Greens in our minority report that this is a piecemeal approach, and the real risk is that it's the New Zealand consumer who will be disadvantaged. Mr Chairman, we are broadly in support of risk-based consenting. That's something that's been the subject of a great deal of discussion through this process, and we'll talk some more about that later in this debate. Enhancements to the licensed building practitioner scheme are welcome. But let me say this finally about the timing issue and the piecemeal, the criticism of this bill being piecemeal. The reason that this bill is being rushed to the House right now in piecemeal form, the reason it's being rushed through is that it has to be there because the licensed building practitioner scheme kicks in March this year. Who put that through? Who put that in place? Whose responsibility is that? So this House is being asked to now pass a highly deficient piecemeal bill because of a time frame that was put in place by this government. It would have been much, much better to do a more comprehensive approach, perhaps staged the process broken up into bigger chunks. But what we are seeing here is a really imperfect and unfortunate piece of legislation.
I call the Honourable Member Chris Ockenville.
Mr Speaker, it's all